We were really interested recently to get the latest from The Watch, which is a Substack run by journalist Radley Balko. Radley focuses extensively on the criminal justice system, and his work is always worth reading.
But his May 25th story, Devil in the Grooves, will be of special interest to people following the Delphi murders case. As we all know, a key part of the case against the accused man, Richard Allen, is the fact that an unspent round found at the crime scene can allegedly be linked back to a weapon owned by Allen. That has led many observers to wonder just how reliable and credible that sort of tool mark evidence actually is.
Radley's story does not deal with Delphi, but it does focus squarely on the important issue of just how much stock we should all put into the testimony of ballistics experts. To quote Radley's story, last February, Chicago Circuit Court Judge William Hooks made some history. He became the first judge in the country to bar the use of ballistics matching testimony in a criminal trial.
The case in question is Illinois versus Ricky Winfield.
What led Judge Hooks to make his surprising ruling? What consequences might it have? Can we expect other judges around the country to join Judge Hooks in barring the testimony of ballistics experts? To help us get our heads around all of this, we asked Radley Balko to join us this week.
My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, The Murdersheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murdersheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews. We're The Murdersheet.
And this is Going Ballistic with Radley Balko. Well, can you tell us about the Illinois versus Ricky Winfield case?
So this is a landmark ruling by this Judge Hooks in Chicago. It was kind of a routine case at first. This guy, Ricky Winfield, was being charged for a gun crime, a shooting. And as they do in a lot of these cases, the state was prepared to call a forensic firearms analyst from the state crime lab who was going to testify that he could match a bullet found at the crime scene to a gun that the state had linked to Winfield, to the exclusion of all other guns on the planet. And this is, this kind of testimony is given dozens of times a day, every day in this country. But in this case, the Cook County Public Defender's Office has a forensics division, and there's an attorney there, an assistant public defender named Richard Gutierrez, who basically has his full-time job is basically becoming an expert on forensic firearms analysis. And he filed a brief requesting a hearing on the scientific validity of this claimed ability to match one bullet to one gun. And the judge heard from experts on both sides and ultimately barred this analyst from testifying. And there have been other courts that have limited what these analysts can say, although, in my opinion, far too few. But this, as far as I know, and as far as the people I interviewed for this article know, this is the first time a judge has outright barred a forensic analyst from testifying on the grounds that, there's no scientific research supporting the kind of foundational premises upon which they claim to be able to match bullets to guns like that.
And I think that's something that a lot of people will find surprising. So I'd like to get into the weeds on that and explain how he came to that conclusion. Can we begin by defining terms? Like, what is pattern matching? What is tool mark identification?
So I guess the first thing to talk about is kind of forensics and where it comes from. So, the term that's often used as forensic science, and I don't use that term for a reason, which is that most fields of forensics were developed within the field of law enforcement. So they were in the 1920s, during the Progressive Era. We saw a lot of specialization in policing, and there was this effort to kind of make police more professional and less of kind of a cronyist job and more of a career, which in a lot of ways was a good thing. But that era also had a lot of pseudoscience floating around, a lot of various other sort of physical features, a lot of criminology. You had racism and anti-immigrant sentiments. And forensics really is kind of born out of all of that. And what we end up getting is, these fields of fingerprinting, ballistics matching, shoe print matching, all these fields that kind of have the sheen and veneer of science. But for decades were used in court, despite the fact that they were never really vetted in a scientific way by a scientific community or subjected to the scientific method. So pattern matching is a broad field, sort of a group of fields within forensics that it basically refers to how analysts are able to link a piece of evidence found at the crime scene to a piece of evidence linked to a suspect or the defendant. And it basically, in all the pattern matching fields, the thing that they have in common is the analyst looks at these two pieces of evidence and just kind of eyeballs them and decides whether or not they're a match. Now, in fingerprinting, we now use computers for most fingerprint matching. And if you have a full print, it's usually there are enough sort of unique identifying features that, it's going to be very difficult to get the wrong person if you have a full fingerprint. Partial prints are where it gets a lot dicier. But for all the other fields of pattern matching, there are no objective criteria, right? There's no margin for error. And the reason why is because we don't know for most of these fields how these unique features, or what analysts claim to be unique features in a piece of evidence, whether it's the marks on a bullet, the marks on a shell casing, teeth marks on human skin, pry marks on a door, tire tracks in dirt or mud or snow. We don't know how often those allegedly unique features occur across the population of those particular things, right? So we don't know that every human bite or human dentition is unique and capable of leaving unique bites. We don't know that every pry bar or screwdriver is going to leave unique marks on the door when someone tries to force open the door with it. And we don't know that every gun leaves unique marks on a bullet when it fires it. And so it's just basically comes down to whether juries find the expert credible or not. And it's based on the experts. Sometimes that they'll factor in the expert's experience and training and time on the job. But a lot of times it's just their ability to come off as a credible witness. And the problem with that is that a lot of times this set of skills it takes to be a persuasive witness to juries aren't necessarily the same set of skills you need to be a good scientist or a good analyst. And in fact, they're often in contradiction of one another. So, for example, juries love certainty. They want to be told, this is who did it. This is why I have no doubt in my mind. Well, science doesn't really operate in those kinds of terms. Science is generally more sort of about percentages and margins for error. And so a more circumspect expert witness is going to be actually less credible to a jury, even though they're probably, testifying with more kind of scientific precision. So we're selecting for the wrong things in our expert witnesses. So within pattern matching, basically, there's no margin for error. It can't be calculated because we don't know the uniqueness of these features. So juries are left to sort of rely on sort of the persuasiveness of the witnesses, and that is not compatible necessarily with their scientific expertise. So Within pattern matching, we have this subfield of forensics called tool mark analysis. Pattern matching can include things like hair analysis, carpet fiber analysis, shoe print analysis. But when we're looking at tool mark analysis, we're looking at a situation where one piece of evidence has created a mark or an indentation or some sort of record on another piece of evidence. So it could be, teeth biting into human skin. Again, it could be a pry bar or screwdriver on a door, or it could be, in this case, the inside of the barrel of a gun, leaving marks on a bullet. And here again, the idea is that the analysts look at these two pieces of evidence. So in the case of a firearms analysis, they would look at a bullet found at the crime scene. They would compare it to a bullet that had been fired by a gun, a test bullet that they had fired by a gun linked to the defendant, and they would, just eyeball it and see if the marks that they see under a microscope on the two bullets are similar, and therefore a match, and then they can, link the bullet to the defendant. So that's kind of, where we are with forensic firearms analysis. It's part of this subfield of tool mark analysis, which then is part of this larger field called pattern matching within forensics.
You keep talking about the experts eyeballing it, and that sounds very subjective, when in science you expect to find, as you say, objectivity. You expect to find results that would be replicable. In other words, you would expect that if I look at a piece of evidence here in Indianapolis and you look at it at your home, and if we're using scientific methods, we'd both get the same results. But if different people are eyeballing it, is there any certainty that they would get the same results and the same findings?
No, in fact, we know that this isn't the case. So when there was a study done a while back called AIMS, the AIMS 1 and AIMS 2 studies, I guess. And, we can get into the weeds about those studies and how they were scored and why they're problematic. But one thing we did learn from those studies is that the second AIMS study looked at verification. So it sent bullets to a bunch of analysts and asked them, if these and asked them to match them to this test bullets. Some were matches, some weren't. And then after that, they sent some of the same samples back to the same analyst, and in other cases sent them to different analysts to look at. And what they found was, I think, if I remember right, it was about 46% of the time, the second analysis of the same evidence came to a different conclusion than the first analysis did. So, looking at this exact same two bullets, 46% of the time, analysts reached a different conclusion on the second go-around. That is barely better than a coin flip. And if you're going to claim that this form of analysis is scientifically sound and fair and objective enough that you're going to send people to prison over it or even to death row over it, a 46% disagreement among analysts would seem to be pretty high for any field that's claiming to be a science.
The murder sheet ensures that we stay busy, running around and reporting on true crime stories.
That means that HelloFresh has become a key part of keeping our week less hectic. This is America's #1 meal kit for a reason. We've enjoyed the journey of becoming at-home chefs and preparing delicious meals without blowing our budget or wasting a ton of time. One recent dish we really enjoyed was the spicy Peruvian chicken and loaded rice with pickled jalapeno and creamy salsa verde.
The chicken was nice and tasty with plenty of spicy flavors. HelloFresh really knows how to pick out ingredients, so you're getting that farm-to-table feel.
One thing that was almost as good as the food was the peace of mind knowing that I didn't botch a grocery trip and forget a key ingredient. We could just be in the moment and have fun cooking together.
Whatever your goals are this summer, consider HelloFresh. If you're looking to connect with friends and family with some backyard cookouts, then keep in mind their crowd-pleasing options like snack boards with pretzel bites, spiced bar nuts, and hot honey peach jam. And if you're trying to mind your health and eat well, you can opt for the Calorie Smart or Protein Smart options. Go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet16 and use code MSheet16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet16 and use code MSheet16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. That's HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. You've touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious, what do scientific groups and organizations generally have to say about ballistics or pattern matching or what have you?
For a long time, the scientific community and the criminal justice community were on separate paths, right? Part of this is there are two very different ways of looking at the world, right? Science is about accumulating knowledge. It's about, coming up with hypotheses, testing those hypotheses, revising your theories, and then this kind of the accumulated knowledge that results from that. The criminal justice system craves sort of stability, consistency. They don't like to change things, even in light of new evidence or new research. And the reason is that, we want the rule of law to apply everyone equally. So we want to have a very set of predictable laws, whether it's, written code or case law, so that everybody knows, that the law applies to them equally. Well, the problem with this is when you start allowing in expert testimony, and science later shows that testimony was erroneous and may have contributed to wrongful convictions, you have this system that relies on precedent and relies on controlling case law that becomes very hesitant to correct itself. One, just because, again, we want this consistency and rule of law. And so there's this priority or a priority is put on this idea of finality, that verdicts should be protected. But also the system that doesn't want to admit its mistakes because it perceives such admissions as an attack on its own legitimacy. So for a long time, scientists just kind of stayed away from the criminal justice system. And that's why this kind of pseudoscience of forensics was allowed to flourish, because there were no real scientists around to sort of subject it to the scientific method. It wasn't until DNA testing comes along in the 1990s, which does emerge from the scientific community, and it has this application in the criminal justice system where it can definitively, without doubt, producing a very, very, very low margin for error, but a margin for error that is calculable. So this is a science. And DNA starts showing that a lot of these fields of forensics that were thought to be, certain and absolute, were sending innocent people to prison. And so at this point, the scientific community becomes interested in double checking a lot of these fields, because the percentage of cases for which DNA is dispositive of guilt is very small, right? There's only cases where you have biological material that can be tested. So, a fairly large percentage of rapes, some percentage of murders, but beyond that, there aren't a lot of cases where DNA is going to be, definitive about someone's guilt or innocence. So, we start seeing these exonerations, and so the scientific community sort of perks up and says, all right, well, if we know that, a significant percentage of people in this small subset of cases which DNA matters have been wrongly convicted, a similar or higher percentage probably exists in other cases as well in the broader criminal justice system. And so they start testing a lot of these fields and start looking at the claims in these fields. And the pattern matching fields of forensics really come under a lot of scrutiny. And the first kind of blow is this 2009 report by the National Academies of Science, which basically says that for pattern matching fields, there just isn't a lot of scientific support for the claims that these analysts make in front of juries. And in fields like bite mark analysis, which is particularly dubious, it has a pretty harsh language. But for other fields, including ballistics or forensic firearms analysis, the report says, we need more testing, we need more research, and we need to be very careful about how we use this type of evidence until we have a better scientific foundation for it. This was followed up by the Texas Forensic Science Commission. So this is a commission that was formed in Texas after a New Yorker report by David Grand showed that a guy named Cameron Todd Willingham had been wrongly convicted and executed based on junk arson testimony. And so this commission is formed to look at other forms of forensic evidence to see, what other unscientific evidence we might be using that may be causing wrongful convictions. And they too criticize forensic firearms analysis. And then we get the President's Council of Science and Technology, PCAST, comes out with another report in, I believe it's 2016, that's also extremely critical. In fact, finds that there's no foundational validity for forensic firearms analysis or for this ability to match one bullet to one gun. So, you have all these scientific bodies that are that have looked at this form of analysis in this field, have said, there's no science here. There's no, this isn't to say that every single forensic firearms analyst who testifies in front of a jury is wrong, or that every conviction is should be overturned, or that these people are all innocent. But they are saying you're using this evidence basically against people, despite the fact that the claims that you're making in court that have no scientific foundation to them. And that's a damning criticism of both the field of forensic firearms analysis, but also of our court's ability to keep just sort of as gatekeepers of good and bad expert testimony. Basically saying that our courts, for literally over a century, have been allowing juries to hear evidence and analysis and conclusions, sometimes pretty damning conclusions, that just have no foundation in science. And, as I point out in the piece, the courts have been really, really slow and reluctant to sort of entertain these criticisms. And, I think a big part of that is because for a judge to accept this criticism of the scientific community would basically be a concession from that judge that the entire system and profession within which this judge has built a career is, fundamentally illegitimate, that it has failed in thousands and thousands and thousands of cases over the better part of a century.
I'm curious, would you say that there has been any sort of movement within the courts or within law enforcement to address any of this, to tighten up the scientific requirements that go into these fields? Or has it by and large been, as you described, this sort of muted, slow, ignore the problem situation?
Yeah, so the reaction from law enforcement across the board on these issues, when any of these fields have been called into question, including really, just utter quackery like bite mark analysis, the reaction for law enforcement has generally been extremely defensive. A lot of times they sort of lash out. When the PCAST report came out, this was the Obama administration. This was Obama's own Council of Presidential Science and Technology Advisors. And when their report came out, Obama's own Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, attacked the report and basically said that the FBI and the Justice Department wouldn't be really paying much attention to it. So I think there is this defensiveness and hostility. A lot of times you hear the scientists who do these studies dismissed by prosecutors and police officials as, activists or, innocence project types. And, it's not fair. I mean, a lot of these scientists aren't getting paid to do this, right? They have other interests and, their professions lie in other fields, but they're doing this out of a sense of kind of community service, public service. And they're being roundly kind of dismissed. As far as the courts, they've, this ruling in Chicago, as I said, it was the first of its kind. There, in the last probably 5 or 6 years, and I laid some of these out in the piece, but there have been lots of decisions, both federal and state courts, I should say, a handful of decisions that have limited what these analysts could say. So, for example, a court might say, well, you can't say this bullet is a match to this gun, or you can't say this bullet could only have been fired from this gun, or you can't say, it's a statistical impossibility that any gun other than this gun could have fired this bullet. Instead, they'll let them say something like, this bullet is consistent with having been fired from this gun, or I can't rule out the possibility that this gun fired this bullet. And those latter two statements, they're not really scientifically problematic. I mean, those are things that you can say, and there's science to back that up because you're excluding rather than sort of zeroing in on one particular gun. The problem, and this is really what kind of sets Judge Hooks' ruling apart from other courts that have limited testimony. The problem is that anybody can say that. There are two sort of types of characteristics that we can look at when we're talking about these bullets and matching guns. One is called class characteristics. And these are really broad categories. So things like the caliber of bullet, the type and style of bullet, the direction that the bullet spins when it comes out of the gun, the number of grooves in the gun barrel that it leaves on the bullet. These are all, pretty broad things. And you can exclude somebody. You can exclude a gun as having fired a particular bullet by saying, well, this gun doesn't fire this caliber bullet, or this gun leaves, 4 grooves and this bullet has 6 grooves on it. But the problem is anybody can say that. That's not expertise. That's really, it's just looking at the bullet and being able to tell what caliber it is. What makes a forensic firearms analyst and expert, and what makes the testimony valuable to a court, to a jury, is their variability to individuate a bullet to a particular gun to the exclusion of all of their guns. And unfortunately for them, that's also the very type of the very part of their testimony that lacks any scientific validity. And so Hooks said, it doesn't make any sense for me to certify this expert and let him testify as an expert if the only testimony he can give scientifically, that's scientifically sound, is testimony that any non-expert could also give. And for that reason, he said it just didn't make any sense to certify him and to let him testify at all. That ruling is the only one of its kind. And I think it makes sense intuitively, but it's a big leap. And it's, Hooks has kind of a history of being skeptical of police and prosecutors, which probably put him in a good position to make that ruling. But, it took some guts. And it also took a willingness to put his legal training aside and look at this as an actual scientist, which, frankly, is a lot to ask of judges. We ask these people who've been trained as lawyers, who've spent their entire life doing legal analysis. Now we suddenly ask them to do a scientific analysis. We shouldn't be surprised when, they don't do that as well as actual scientists. And that's really kind of the rub of the problem when determining what expert testimony gets in and what doesn't.
What an impact do you expect to see the ruling in the Winfield case have? And I guess, do you imagine that other judges will begin to make similar rulings, or is it too soon to say?
So, I think it depends on if the state appeals. Right now, it looks like they probably are going to appeal. It depends on whether it holds up. I've been told by people familiar with the case that the odds are that it won't be heard on appeal, so it won't be shot down, but it won't be positively affirmed either, which means that would hold. It is only limited to that particular court in Chicago. But what a ruling like this does do is it creates a record, of a judge saying this. And in Illinois in particular, one big hurdle that defendants face in these cases is that there's just a wall of case law, a century old, saying that this kind of evidence is legitimate, court after court after court letting it in. And there's no court that's kind of stood up and said no. And so when you bring a challenge like this, it's almost, it's basically just a waste of time because you're going to lose because you've got all this precedent to overcome. So what this ruling does is it creates a record, and now there's a citation that they can point to saying, look, here's a very recent ruling from a court in Chicago. And so I think I think it definitely means that if you're a defendant in Judge Hooks's court, you're probably going to be successful at getting this kind of evidence thrown out. If you're in another Chicago court, it will probably be easier for your attorney to make a challenge to this kind of evidence. It's going to depend on the judge. So, it's kind of a, it's not a watershed moment, but it's a small leak in the dam that could lead to a watershed moment. In terms of the impact, I talk about this in the piece. I firmly believe that this type of evidence is not based in science. I don't think it should be used to convict people. I think it can be used to guide police investigations, to tell them who they need to be investigating. But the idea of convicting someone based only on this type of evidence, I think, is really, really problematic. But I do think, to acknowledge kind of reality, this ruling is going to make it a lot harder to prosecute gun crimes in Chicago, or at least in Hooks's court. And that's going to, police and prosecutors are going to raise hell about that. And I think particularly in a place like Chicago, which has a reputation as being a violent city, you're going to see a lot of backlash if this ruling leads to more cases being against, people accused of shootings being thrown out. That said, we have the system we have for a reason. We have the rule of law, and we have constitutional rights, and we don't bend those rules, or at least we shouldn't, because we want to make it easier to put people in prison, because what ends up happening, as we've seen in these other cases with DNA testing, is yes, you end up convicting someone for a crime, but you end up convicting, just anyone for a crime instead of the correct person. And then not only have you wrongly convicted an innocent person and all the harm that comes with that, both of them and their family and friends and community, but the actual perpetrator is still loose and can go on to commit other crimes. So, I think it's crucial that we only use evidence, that has some scientific foundation and validity in these cases.
In your piece, you mentioned that, while doing research into this topic, you learned something that even after, as you said, 20 years on this beat, still managed to astonish you. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so this is pretty remarkable. So in the pattern matching fields, as I said, an analyst will look at a piece of evidence that's connected to the crime scene or the victim, and they'll try to match it to a piece of evidence connected to the suspect or the defendant. Again, it's sort of an eyeball situation. They just look at the two pieces and decide if they're a match. And so they usually make one of three conclusions. Either it's a match or an inclusion, as some call it. It's not a match, or what they call an exclusion, or some version of undetermined, which means there's not enough evidence to say either way. And, over the years, there have been a number of exposés and investigative journalism reports and other sort of investigations that have shown that in a lot of cases over the years, when crime lab analysts look at two pieces of evidence and determine that they are not a match, they'll just say it's inconclusive. And this will allow prosecutors to go ahead with their case, and they'll never let the defense know that their test actually showed that they could exclude the defendant as the source of this particular evidence. Instead, they just say, well, the evidence was too mangled and it's inconclusive. There's a great podcast that just came out called Admissible. It looks into blood typing evidence. And this was, where they look at, if you have type A or B or O. And what they found at this particular crime lab in Virginia over the years is that this one particular analyst, but in many, many, many cases, when she ran the test and found that a particular type of blood found at the crime scene was not a match to the defendant, she merely just said it was inconclusive. And when she should have said, no, it's not a match and it couldn't be the defendant. And she would come up with some excuse like, well, bacteria must have gotten into the blood and degraded it, so I couldn't really make a match. And, bacteria is not going to corrupt a supply of blood to change it from one blood type to another. And we found this in a lot of cases over the years where you go back and you look at the actual notes from the analyst, and it shows that it should have been an exclusion, and instead they merely say, that's inconclusive. Well, that at least is sort of recognized as wrong, right? When we've learned about these things, there have been investigations, there have been exposés. People, a lot of times the crime lab officials, political officials, or law enforcement people, maybe they won't acknowledge it's as much of a problem as it is. Maybe they should have done more investigation, but nobody's defending this, right? Nobody's saying it's okay to basically lie about what your test results showed. Well, when I started researching this, and prior to this, I had looked at a lot of these other areas of forensics. I hadn't done a lot of reporting into forensic firearms analysis. And what I found when I started looking into this is that at most crime labs across the country, including the Illinois State Crime Lab, which is involved in this case, and the FBI Crime Lab, which is generally seen as one of the most prestigious in the world, they will not exclude a defendant as a matter of policy. So they will say, yes, I can match this bullet to this gun to the exclusion of all other guns on the planet, with the effect being that this person now goes to prison. But they will not say, as a matter of written policy, that I can exclude this gun as having fired this bullet. And to me, that was remarkable. In any case where they should be able to exclude a bullet, they'll just say inconclusive. So from the perspective of prosecutors, you can't lose when you send a bullet and a gun to the crime lab, right? Your case can only get stronger. And that is not, we think of science as objective, as neutral. We want to think of science as applied in the criminal justice system as fair. And if the only possible outcomes from one of these analyses is either the defendant is implicated or it's just kind of a wash, even if the evidence says the defendant should be exonerated, that's not a fair, just, or objective field. And so I was really kind of blown away by this. And, the reasoning as it was explained to me is even more puzzling. And the reason they say is that, well, over the course of its lifetime of use, these grooves inside of a gun barrel, these are the grooves that, spin the bullet, but they also leave these tiny little microscopic marks that they say that, make that gun unique. Well, over the course of the lifetime of use, those grooves will wear down, and the little structures, the tiny structures inside those grooves that leave these marks will also wear down. So a gun's going to leave different marks over the course of its life. And so they can't say definitively that a particular gun could not possibly have left these particular marks. Well, that on its own makes a lot of sense, right? But when you think about what they're doing when they're matching one gun to one bullet definitively to the exclusion of all other guns, they are saying no other gun but this one could have left these marks. And they'll say that to implicate someone, but they won't say one gun couldn't have left these marks. So it's like you're saying, I can say every other gun on the planet couldn't possibly have left these marks, and you can send this guy to prison for that. But I'm not going to say that this one gun could not have left these marks, in which case this person would be exonerated. And to me, that is just, I was floored when I read that. I would not have been surprised to have read that a particular rogue analyst did that, or that even if it was common, but for it to be the written policy of these crime labs really kind of blew me away.
Is there anything else you wanted to mention or address?
Well, I guess one thing that I found kind of interesting, it's a little bit in the weeds, but I will say, so because we can't calculate a margin for error when it comes to these bullets, we can't say the odds of any gun other than this one creating these marks are, 1 in whatever. And we can do that for DNA. But because we can't do that, we have to, how do we judge the credibility of these experts? Well, one way to do it is if they claim that they can match a bullet to a gun to the exclusion of all their guns, we could just test them, right? We could give them a test with bullets and guns and see if they are any good at matching them up. And over the years, they've been very resistant to these kinds of tests. Eventually, after a lot of these scientific criticisms came out, they started administering themselves tests, which were sort of comically, easy. In one case, in fact, the state's expert in this Illinois case in Chicago, one test he administered, some public defenders in New York got a copy of the test and gave it to about a half dozen lawyers in their office, none of whom had any ballistics training at all, and they all passed it with flying colors, which, that again just proves that if you're going to say that this test is what makes me an expert and somebody who has no expertise is able to pass it with flying colors, that should say something about your expertise. But there were a couple of tests, these Ames tests that were administered in Ames, Iowa. They were more difficult. They were what you call a traditional black box test, which is they had to match one bullet to one gun, or they were given one bullet and then a test bullet, and they had to say whether they were a match or not. Well, the interesting thing is that these tests were administered, they were administered in a way that, with a few exceptions, most of the scientific community thought, these were legitimate tests. And what happened is the forensics firearms community said, oh, look, we got really, really low error rates on these tests, which just proves that this is a legitimate field. Well, the problem is the tests were designed to elicit one of two answers. Either these two bullets are a match, they were fired by the same gun, or they're not a match. They were not fired by the same gun. What happened was there were a disproportionate number of inconclusive answers. So while the test, the people who administered the test knew the answer to every question. It was either an exclusion or inclusion. But in a very high percentage for a very high percentage of the questions, the test takers responded with inconclusive. Well, what do you do with those inconclusive answers? You can do one of three things. You can either count them as correct, or you can just eliminate them and not consider them at all, or you can count them as incorrect. And so as it turns out, there were so many inconclusive answers that if you counted them as a correct, you had a very, very low margin for error, less than 1% on most questions. If you counted them as incorrect, the error rate shot up to almost 40%. So what do we do with that? Well, the problem is that if the test takers know, and they did know, that if they answer inconclusive, it's going to be counted correct no matter what, well, what are you going to do? You're going to answer inconclusive for any question you're not sure of. And Richard Gutierrez, the defense attorney who wrote the brief in this case, likened it to a math test, right? If you give me a math test to measure my proficiency at math, and there are 100 questions, and ranging from 1 + 1 = what to advanced trigonometry and calculus. If I'm able to just write inconclusive for any question I think is too hard and I'm not 100% certain about, and those will be counted as correct. I'm going to ace that test every time, right? I'm going to get 100% every time. If you just simply eliminate any question for which I answer inconclusive, I'm still going to ace it because I'm only going to answer the questions that I definitely know the answer to. And maybe my score is, 10 out of 10 instead of 100 out of 100, but it's still going to be 100%. What you want to do, what these tests need to do, is they need to measure these analysts' performance in a way that reflects their day-to-day work. And the problem is when they know they're being tested, they're going to change how they approach these questions. And so what we need to do is test these analysts as they do their jobs day to day. And there's one crime lab in the country that has done that, and that's the Houston Forensic Science Center. And this is a crime lab that was created after a number of scandals in Houston involving the old crime labs there. And it's run by this guy, Peter Stout, who, is committed basically to running this lab within the kind of context and principles of science. And so one thing he does regularly is he incorporates test cases into his analyst day-to-day work. And the idea is to mask them so the analysts don't know when they're being tested. And so what he does is he offers a Starbucks gift card to any of his analysts who can flag a test. And, when they know that this is a fake test, whether it's not an actual case. And so over the years, he's gotten better at masking them. But what he found with his forensic firearms analyst is the error rate, I got to see if I can remember these numbers correctly, I believe it was somewhere between 10 and 40%, depending on whether they were. There's two ways you can be tested here. You can say, were these two bullets fired by the same gun, or were these two bullets fired by different guns? And so the error rate among his analysts were somewhere between 10 and 40%. And to his credit, he wanted to know this. He wasn't trying, he limits what his analysts can say in court. He only lets them testify, give testimony that's based in science. And because his test found that the ability to match one bullet to one gun isn't grounded in science, or his analysts just weren't very good at it, he doesn't allow them to testify to that. And I think that's what we need more of, not just scrutiny from the courts, not just, the ability of law enforcement and prosecutors to admit they were wrong and to be able to let go of unscientific evidence. But we also need, more conscientiousness and change and reform within the forensics professions themselves. I think Stout's a great example of how that can be done.
We'd like to thank Radley for taking the time to talk with us. If you want more information on this or any of the other important subjects that Radley covers, we recommend you check out his Substack, which is called The Watch. He makes his stories available for no cost, but if you enjoy them and can afford it, you can become a paid subscriber and support Radley's independent journalism. We will include a link in our show notes.
And if you'd like to get other perspectives on ballistics evidence, check out our previous episodes: the Delphi murders, conversations with a firearms expert and a forensic examiner, and the Delphi murders, conversations with a firearms expert and a professional investigator. We'll include those links in our show notes as well.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening. Hello, Murder Sheet listeners. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end. Just wanted to take a moment as we close out to thank our sponsor, HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. They are #1 for a reason, folks. Kevin and I have been loving the meals we're getting from HelloFresh. We're talking farm fresh produce, protein, all sorts of customizable options to get you exactly what you and your family need. It's very delicious, it's very nutritious, and it's quite affordable. So it ticks off all our boxes. We've been very happy with the service. And, would love for you guys to try it out if you're curious, or if you've tried it out in the past and enjoyed it, get that discount. It's hellofresh.com/msheet16. And then you're going to plug in the code msheet16. You get 16 free meals plus free shipping. You can't beat that. We've really been delighted by it. We work very hard on the podcast. It takes up a lot of time. It's our small business. We really enjoy the work. We enjoy conversing with all of you every week. But at the same time, it's nice for Kevin and I to kind of have something to do outside of office hours, and cooking these meals has been really fun. We're terrible in the kitchen, like disastrous. I mean, like I can tell you horror stories. I probably shouldn't get into it on the podcast, but I mean, some pretty disastrous moments involving our cooking. Nothing life-threatening, but definitely stuff that we tried to be overly ambitious about, and it either went horribly wrong or it ended up costing like way more than it should have because we didn't properly like think about ingredients, and we're not gifted in the realm of the kitchen. But HelloFresh makes us pretend like we are, because everything is so pre-portioned and pre-planned, and the instructions are super clear, so like you're not going to mess it up if you're like us. And if you're good in the kitchen, then it's just less of a hassle, and you get everything that you need. You don't have to run out to the grocery store. So super nice. Try it out. I've really enjoyed the meals that they've sent us so far. I can say that Kevin has too. I highlight that because Kevin is pretty picky when it comes to food. He does not like everything. He has pretty strong specifications and preferences. Very much cares about things like fresh produce and farm produce and things like that. So he's very picky, and I think the fact that he is really enjoying HelloFresh is a testament to the quality here, because he's a stickler for that kind of thing. And so if you are, I think you will enjoy it as well. And again, the URL and promo code that'll get you a sweet discount is hellofresh.com/msheet16. That's MSHEET 16. And use code msheet16. You're going to get 16 free meals plus free shipping. We hope you enjoy it. And again, thank you so much for listening.